July 1st, 1946. Dawn breaks over Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. A lone B-29 superfortress circles overhead. Its cargo bay holds a single plutonium bomb nicknamed Gilda. Below, 95 warships sit arranged in perfect formation across the lagoon's turquoise waters. Battleships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, a floating graveyard waiting to be born. At exactly 9:07 a.m. local time, the bomb bay doors open. 23,000 tons of nuclear fire are about to rewrite the rules of naval warfare forever. But this isn't war. This is science. The deadliest science experiment in human history. Operation Crossroads didn't begin with that bomb drop. It began 8 months earlier in a Pentagon conference room, August 16, 1945. Lewis Strauss, a Naval Reserve officer, proposed something unprecedented. What would happen if we detonated an atomic bomb against a fleet of ships? The war with Japan had just ended. Hiroshima and Nagasaki lay in radioactive ruins, but military planners were already thinking ahead. The Navy needed answers. Would aircraft carriers survive atomic attack? Could battleships withstand nuclear fire? How would radiation affect crews? There was only one way to find out. By October 27, 1945, Fleet Admiral Ernest King made the announcement public. America would conduct atomic tests on captured enemy vessels and obsolete U.S. ships. The location, Bikini Atoll, a remote coral ring in the Pacific, home to 167 Marshallese Islanders. On March 7, 1946, those islanders were told they had to leave. For the good of mankind, they were told. To end all wars. They packed their belongings into small boats and sailed away from the only home they'd ever known. They thought they'd be back in a few months. They were wrong. Before we dive in, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. Joint Task Force 1 assembled the largest peacetime naval operation in history. 242 ships, 39,300 Navy personnel, an estimated 44,000 total participants. Admiral William H.P. Blandy commanded the operation. His deputy, Rear Admiral William S. Deke Parsons, the same man who had armed the bomb over Hiroshima. They painted USS Nevada bright orange, a massive bullseye for the incoming atomic bomb. The target fleet spread across Bikini Lagoon like pieces on a chessboard. German cruiser Prince Eugen, Japanese battleship Nagato, USS Saratoga, the aircraft carrier that had survived Pearl Harbor. Ships that had fought across 2 oceans now waited silently for annihilation. July 1st arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, calm seas. The B-29 approached from the southeast. 80 aircraft circled overhead, cameras rolling. Gilda fell for 43 seconds. Then the world changed. A fireball brighter than the sun erupted 520 feet above the lagoon. The mushroom cloud climbed 40,000 feet into the Pacific sky. But something went wrong. The bomb missed its target by 2,130 feet. USS Nevada, painted bright orange to guide the bombardier, sat outside the zone of maximum destruction. The miss saved dozens of ships from immediate sinking, but it couldn't save them from what came next. Test Able sank 5 vessels immediately. Destroyers and transports crumpled like tin cans, but most of the fleet survived, their hulls scorched but intact. Military observers called it disappointing. The Navy's worst fears hadn't materialized. Ships could survive atomic attack. Or so they thought. Test Baker was 24 days away. This time, the bomb would detonate underwater. This time, there would be no miss. July 25th, 1946. USS LSM-60 carried Helen of Bikini into position, 90 feet beneath the surface, dead center of the target fleet. At 8:35 a.m., Helen detonated. What happened next terrified everyone watching. The underwater detonation created something no one expected. A column of radioactive water shot 2,000 feet into the sky, a hollow tower of death climbing toward the clouds. At its peak, the column collapsed. Billions of gallons of contaminated seawater crashed back into the lagoon, creating a massive wave that raced outward in all directions. But the real killer came next. As the water column fell, it created what scientists called a base surge, a rolling cloud of radioactive mist that spread across the surface like fog. But this wasn't fog. This was a cloud of fission products, plutonium particles. Radioactive salt water turned into deadly vapor. The surge moved at 30 miles per hour. It engulfed every ship in its path, coating hulls and decks with invisible death. Within seconds, USS Arkansas vanished beneath the waves. The 35,000-ton battleship simply disappeared, pulled down by the massive underwater blast. USS Saratoga followed minutes later. The carrier that had survived Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Iwo Jima couldn't survive this. 8 ships sank immediately. But sinking was the least of anyone's problems. The base surge painted every surviving vessel with radioactive contamination. Decks, superstructures, ventilation systems. Everything the mist touched became a radiation source. Sailors watching from distant ships saw the cloud approaching. Some tried to cover their faces. Others dove below deck. It didn't matter. The contamination was everywhere. Admiral Blandy had positioned observation ships at what he thought was a safe distance, 7 miles from ground zero. The base surge reached them anyway. Geiger counters started clicking frantically. Film badges worn by personnel began fogging from radiation exposure. The permitted exposure limit was set at 0.1 Röntgen per day. Some sailors absorbed that much in minutes. 18,875 film badges were distributed to monitor radiation exposure. The maximum recorded individual dose reached 3.72 Röntgens. That was just what they measured. Much went unmeasured. 6 days after Baker, 4,900 men boarded the contaminated target ships. Their mission? Wash away the radiation. They used seawater, soap, and lye, scrubbing brushes, high-pressure hoses. The first washdown cut radioactivity levels in half. Success, the Navy declared. But subsequent washdowns did nothing. The contamination had bonded with the metal. It wouldn't come off. Some ships required sandblasting down to bare steel. Even that didn't work completely. Dr. Stafford L. Warren, the operations chief medical officer, watched the cleanup efforts with growing alarm. Warren had helped design the Manhattan Project's safety protocols. He understood radiation better than almost anyone alive. What he saw at Bikini terrified him. On August 10, 1946, Warren issued an order that shocked the Navy leadership. Stop all decontamination efforts, immediately. Warren warned of great risks of harm from plutonium contamination. The base surge hadn't just deposited radiation on ship surfaces, it had driven radioactive particles deep into cracks and crevices, into ventilation systems, into crew quarters, where sailors would live and sleep. Personnel were unknowingly tracking contamination throughout their ships. Their living spaces were becoming radiation sources. The Navy had created floating death traps. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from today, and if this story hits you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. The political implications hit Washington like a shockwave. Operation Crossroads was supposed to demonstrate American atomic superiority. Instead, it revealed American atomic ignorance. The tests were being broadcast worldwide. International observers documented every failure. The Soviet Union watched with particular interest. America had just shown the world that atomic weapons could contaminate vast areas for extended periods. That decontamination was nearly impossible. That nuclear war might render entire regions uninhabitable. Japanese battleship Nagato, captured after the war, finally succumbed on July 29th. The ship that had carried Admiral Yamamoto to plan Pearl Harbor now rested on the bottom of Bikini Lagoon. German cruiser Prinz Eugen survived both atomic blasts, but the contamination was killing it slowly. The Navy towed Prinz Eugen to Kwajalein Atoll, hoping distance would solve the radiation problem. On December 22, 1946, the cruiser capsized and sank. Even in death, it remained radioactive. By late summer, the truth was undeniable. 53 heavily contaminated target vessels could never return to any port. The Navy couldn't risk towing floating radiation sources into harbors where civilians lived and worked. The solution was brutal in its simplicity. Scuttle them in deep ocean water. Bury the evidence thousands of feet beneath the Pacific. 21 ships would remain at Bikini Lagoon, too contaminated to move but too valuable to sink. They became permanent monuments to atomic miscalculation. The planned third test, codenamed Charlie, was quietly cancelled. The deep-water detonation would have to wait. 9 years later, Operation Wigwam would finally test underwater atomic explosions in the deep Pacific. But the lessons of Crossroads were already written in radioactive steel and contaminated coral. Atomic weapons weren't just bigger bombs. They were something entirely new, something that could make the Earth itself uninhabitable. Rongerik Atoll. March 1947. 167 Bikini Islanders sat on a beach smaller than a city block. Around them, coconut palms withered in sandy soil that couldn't sustain them. The fish were gone. The birds had stopped coming. The The lagoon that was supposed to feed them held nothing but empty water. They had been living on Rongerik for exactly 1 year. They were slowly starving. The US Navy had promised the Bikinians they could return home in a few months, after the atomic tests ended, after the radiation faded. But radiation doesn't fade the way Navy planners thought it would. Cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years. Every 30 years, the radioactivity drops by half, but half of deadly is still dangerous. The coconut crabs that once fed the islanders now concentrated cesium in their shells. The breadfruit trees absorbed it through their roots. The fish carried it in their flesh. Bikini Atoll had become a radioactive ecosystem. In 1948, the Navy moved the Bikinians again, first to Kwajalein, where they lived in tents among military personnel, then to Kili Island, a single islet with no lagoon, no protected waters for fishing, no tradition of survival in such a place. The Bikinians were ocean people trying to live on a rock. Many elders died in exile, never seeing their homeland again. Children grew up speaking of Bikini as a mythical place they'd never experienced. An entire culture was disappearing, along with the radioactive decay. In Washington, Operation Crossroads was driving major policy changes. On January 24, 1946, the United Nations established its Atomic Energy Commission. The goal: international control of nuclear weapons. On August 1, 1946, President Truman signed the Atomic Energy Act. For the first time in history, civilian authorities would control nuclear weapons and fissionable materials. The military had proven it couldn't be trusted with atomic power. Crossroads had demonstrated that clearly. But there was an unintended cultural impact too. On July 5, 1946, French designer Jacques Haim introduced a new two-piece swimsuit. He named it after the atomic test site that was dominating headlines worldwide. The bikini, an item of clothing named after nuclear devastation. A fashion statement born from radioactive displacement. The irony was lost on most Americans, who saw only the glamour of atomic power. By the 1960s, US authorities declared Bikini safe for resettlement. Scientists claimed the radiation had dropped to acceptable levels. In 1968, some Bikinians returned home. They planted new crops, rebuilt their community, tried to resurrect their traditional way of life. For 10 years, it seemed to work. Then, the blood tests came back. Cesium-137 levels in the returnees were skyrocketing. The locally grown food was concentrating radiation in human bodies at dangerous rates. In 1978, the US government evacuated Bikini again. 32 years after the atomic tests, the atoll was still too contaminated for human habitation. The second exile was somehow worse than the first. These islanders had tasted hope. International Atomic Energy Agency assessments in 1998 estimated radiation doses at Bikini of 15 millisieverts per year for people eating local foods. That's 3 times the recommended limit for nuclear workers. Scientists discovered that potassium fertilizer could reduce cesium uptake in coconut trees by 95%. Expensive treatments that might someday make resettlement possible. But someday had been the promise for 50 years. The environmental half-life of cesium-137 in coral atolls was measured at 8.5 years, faster than the 30-year physical half-life, but still generationally slow. Children born in exile were having children of their own, grandchildren who spoke English or Marshallese, but not the traditional Bikinian dialect. The radiation was fading faster than the culture it had displaced. Glenn Seaborg, a Nobel Prize-winning chemist who helped discover plutonium, later called Test Baker, the world's first nuclear disaster. Not Hiroshima, not Nagasaki. Those were acts of war. Bikini was something new. Peacetime contamination. Self-inflicted environmental destruction in the name of science. The precedent was terrifying. Today, the lagoon holds one of the world's most unique underwater museums. The atomic fleet rests on the bottom in crystal-clear tropical water. USS Saratoga lies intact at 130 feet. USS Arkansas sits inverted, its massive guns pointing into the sand. Divers come from around the world to explore these atomic graves. The radiation levels are now low enough for brief visits, but the Bikinians still can't come home to stay. The paradox is haunting. The weapons designed to end all wars created a conflict that never ends. The islanders versus the atom. Tradition versus technology. Memory versus radiation. 50 years of exile for 60 seconds of nuclear fire. Who won that war? October 29th, 1962. The Caribbean Sea. President John F. Kennedy, stares at reconnaissance photos of Soviet missile sites in Cuba, nuclear warheads pointed at American cities. The world stands 13 days from nuclear war. Kennedy's advisors debate invasion plans, airstrikes, naval blockades. But Kennedy remembers something else, something that happened 16 years earlier in a turquoise lagoon 8,000 miles away. He remembers that nuclear weapons don't just destroy targets, they contaminate everything they touch. Operation Crossroads had taught the world a lesson nobody wanted to learn. Atomic weapons weren't just bigger bombs, they were geological forces. They could render entire regions uninhabitable for generations. The base surge at Bikini had shown what radioactive contamination really meant. Not just immediate death, but slow poisoning, environmental destruction that outlasted empires. Kennedy chose blockade over invasion, negotiation over annihilation. Bikini's ghosts may have saved the world, but the atomic testing didn't stop after Crossroads. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands. Castle Bravo in 1954 yielded 15 megatons, 650 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The fallout clouds stretched 7,000 square miles. It contaminated populated atolls the US government had declared safe. Japanese fishermen on the Lucky Dragon suffered acute radiation sickness. One died. Each test built on data from Crossroads, the radiological contamination patterns, the base surge effects, the failure of decontamination efforts. Scientists used Bikini's contaminated ecosystem as a natural laboratory. They studied how radiation moved through coral, fish, and vegetation. They placed goats, pigs, and rats on target ships during the original tests, animal subjects to measure biological effects. The data was invaluable. The cost was measured in displaced populations and poisoned environments. Dr. Stafford, Warren's warnings about plutonium contamination became the foundation for modern radiation safety protocols. The film badges that recorded exposure levels, the permissible dose limits, the understanding that radioactive particles could be inhaled and ingested. All of it traced back to those terrifying weeks when Navy sailors unknowingly tracked death through their ships. Warren had prevented a radiological disaster among American military personnel, but he couldn't prevent the larger catastrophe. The political implications of Crossroads echoed through the Cold War. The Soviet Union studied every detail of American atomic testing. They learned that nuclear weapons created long-term environmental problems. They also learned that democratic societies struggled with the moral implications of atomic warfare. Stalin launched the Soviet nuclear program with one goal: achieve atomic parity with the United States. The arms race that nearly destroyed civilization began in the contaminated waters of Bikini Lagoon. In 1963, President Kennedy signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty. Nuclear testing would move underground. No more atmospheric explosions. No more radioactive clouds drifting across international borders. The treaty didn't mention Bikini by name. But the Marshallese Islands were its hidden signature. 167 displaced islanders had changed the course of nuclear policy. Their sacrifice had made atmospheric testing politically impossible. The medical studies continued for decades. Researchers tracked radiation exposure in Pacific test veterans, cancer rates, genetic effects, long-term health consequences. The data was sobering. Even brief exposure to atomic testing could cause health problems decades later. Some veterans developed leukemia, others suffered thyroid cancer. Reproductive issues appeared in their children. The human cost of atomic testing was still being calculated 60 years after the fact. Today, Bikini Atoll sits empty, except for scientific researchers and occasional divers. The coconut crabs still concentrate cesium in their shells. The soil still holds traces of plutonium. The coral grows over radioactive ship hulls. Nature has reclaimed the atomic testing ground, but the contamination remains woven into its DNA. Some scientists argue the atoll could support limited resettlement with proper dietary controls and imported food. Others say the risk will never be acceptable. The Bikinians scattered across the Pacific still dream of home. Many have never seen the atoll where their grandparents lived. They know it only through stories passed down through generations. Stories of breadfruit trees and fishing grounds, of traditional navigation and seasonal ceremonies. Stories of a world that atomic fire erased in 60 seconds. Operation Crossroads was supposed to demonstrate American atomic superiority. Instead, it revealed something more disturbing. Nuclear weapons don't just kill enemy soldiers, they kill the environment itself. They contaminate the air and water and soil that sustain all life. They turned the Earth into a weapon against its own inhabitants. The two bombs dropped on Japan in 1945 ended a world war. The two bombs exploded at Bikini in 1946 started a different kind of a war between human ambition and natural law, between technological power and environmental limits, between the desire to control atomic energy and the reality that atomic energy controls everything it touches. Glenn Seaborg called Test Baker the world's first nuclear disaster. But disasters imply accidents, unexpected failures, acts of nature, or human error. Crossroads was none of those things. It was a deliberate choice to poison a paradise in the name of science, to exile a people in the name of progress, to sacrifice the present for an uncertain future. 79 years later, the questions raised by Operation Crossroads remain unanswered. How much environmental destruction is acceptable for national security? How many displaced populations can progress justify? When does scientific knowledge become too dangerous to pursue? The Bikinians are still waiting for answers, still waiting to go home, still paying the price for 60 seconds of nuclear fire that lit up the world and cast shadows that may never fade. That's the true legacy of Operation Crossroads, not the ships that sank or the data that was gathered, but the realization that some scientific experiments change the world in ways we can never undo. Some questions should never be asked. Some prices are too high to pay. The Pacific remembers. The coral remembers. The displaced islanders remember. The atom remembers everything. If this story made you think about the hidden costs of our technological choices, consider subscribing to hear more stories that challenge how we see progress. And let us know in the comments, what price are we still paying for decisions made in the name of science? Because somewhere in the Pacific, empty islands are still waiting for their people to come home.